How's it going, guys? Cameron here with Canadian Gamer, coming at you with another video. Just playing around with my lighting in the room here. I don't know how this is going to translate once I upload the video. We'll see. It already looks like the light is kind of beaming off of my picture here. So, I don't know. We'll see. I'm using the one of the camcorders I have, the one I most recently picked up here, records at a low resolution 480p. I know you guys love it, so I continue to use it. And like I said, you don't need to see me in 4K to hear what's coming out of my mouth, do you? So I always sort of my motto has been to run this channel on a shoestring budget, and I have better cameras that could record in better resolution. I just oftentimes choose not to use those cameras, and I do that in defiance, because I want to show you guys out there that you don't need expensive, high-end technology to create YouTube videos. So that's why I use this camera once in a while, just to change things up. So now, I was out today on the trails. You can see a little bit of footage here to get things started. You guys can watch this as I start rambling, as I always do. Now, there's a topic I wanted to discuss today. I've talked about it before on the channel, but I wanted to sort of bring it up again. I've really been meaning to talk about this. And that's the old argument, the Sega Genesis versus the Super Nintendo. The war rages on. So, you know, I've been wrong about this topic before. I think back in the day I talked about this on the channel, and I was adamant that at the end of the day, the Super Nintendo was the better console between the two. I think my argument was it just had better games. Now, you know, seeing as I've started to collect for the Sega Genesis again over the last couple of years, and I've amassed a pretty substantial collection of physical carts. Now, they're not all heavy hitters. Some of them are some of the cheaper titles you can find on the console, but that doesn't mean that they're bad games by any means. So I'm really passionate about this topic, I would like to think. And this is a very loose, off-the-cuff discussion about this. And it's very, very free-flowing. You know, at the end of the video, you know, feel free to chime in the comments if you'd like to add to this topic. But I guess what I'm getting at is the more and more I become more intimately involved with the Sega Genesis and explore the catalog of games that is available for this console, the more I begin to feel like this console makes more sense for the 39-year-old CG versus the 10-year-old CG that had a Super Nintendo back in the day. I don't know if that makes sense. You know, like, when we're talking about the Super Nintendo, just to kind of give you an example, you know, it's always praised for its Mode 7 graphics. That's just a term, right? That just describes, you know, the special, whatever you want to call it, MIP mapping technique that they use with the scaling. It wasn't necessarily revolutionary. You know, we had games like that on the PC already before Mario Kart came out and F-Zero. But I find when I look at any of those older Super NES games with the Mode 7 graphics, the 10-year-old in me back in 1993 was very impressed with those graphics when it was in period. And what I mean by that is at the time when those games came out, it looked impressive. However, the 39-year-old CG, looking at these games on the Super Nintendo with the Mode 7 graphics, I just don't find that they hold up as well. And I'm not talking about, yeah, of course, it's the year 2023. Of course, it doesn't pop like it did 30 years ago, these games on the Super Nintendo. But I just mean, nowadays when I look at comparing certain games on the Genesis versus the Super Nintendo, I find the hand-drawn sprites of a lot of the aesthetics. Obviously the Sega Genesis didn't have Mode 7. I find that style of the graphics is kind of like a fine wine. It gets better with age. And an example would be, I don't want to just bring up racing games, but obviously I've been on a kick. When you look at F-Zero, which is a very iconic game on the Super Nintendo, and then you look at Outrun 2019, which I have up here somewhere, I find Outrun 2019 looks better. I find that aesthetic looks better. I just do. But if you ask the general public, if you did a poll, which game is the better game, 99.999% of the audience is probably going to say F-Zero, because not enough people actually gave this game a chance, or perhaps they never even played it. But I just find the more and more I get deep into the Sega Genesis catalog of games, the more I really begin to appreciate the console. And the other thing I really, 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 really want to stress is I've been watching a lot of comparison videos. And what I mean by that, there are a lot of games, obviously, that were released for the Super Nintendo and the Sega Genesis at the same time, right? They were multiplats. And you guys can do your own research, but if you look it up, there's a few channels on YouTube that specifically post videos that show side-by-side comparisons. 9 times out of 10, the Sega Genesis had the superior version of said game. I'm telling you guys, if you don't believe me, look it up yourself, okay? We're talking Flashback, Out of This World, Pitfall, NBA Jam, the Mortal Kombat games. You could argue that one, I guess, with regards to Mortal Kombat 2. The list goes on. It's insane how much better the games not necessarily look on the Sega Genesis, because we know it had a limited color palette of, I believe, 64 colors, and the Super NES had, what would you say, VGA? 256 colors? But even then, even still, as crazy as it sounds, I find sometimes with the Sega Genesis having a limited color palette, it kind of gave the games a bit of a grittier aesthetic. Whereas a lot of times on the Super Nintendo, the developers went hog wild with the color palette and actually made the game look worse. So an example would be Top Gear 2, another racing game. Now there are some who would say Top Gear 2 is better on the Super Nintendo. Again, that's open to discussion. I think it runs a lot smoother on the Sega Genesis. But if you look at the side-by-side comparisons, I actually find the Sega Genesis version looks better. I just do. Because, if you walked outside on a typical day, the colors that you're seeing with your eyes, the brick walls, the sky, the pavement, the grass, it's not super saturated. Let's be honest here, right? Things, for the most part, are pretty dull, right? Unless you're walking through Disney World. So I think a lot of the developers, so not necessarily the Super Nintendo's fault, but a lot of the developers got all hot and horny with the available color palettes, and sometimes they just went a little bit overboard with these games. Now, when we get into the topic of which console is better than the other, I'm not ashamed to admit I was wrong when I said the Super Nintendo was better than the Sega Genesis. The reality is, neither console is better than the other. They're both different. It just really comes down to personal taste. So, with the Super Nintendo, it has a lot of great exclusives, right? It does. It's got Zelda. It's got a lot of those Square Enix RPGs, the Donkey Kong Country games, Super Metroid, Super Mario Brothers. There's a lot of great exclusives on the Super Nintendo. However, there were a lot of great exclusives on the Sega Genesis. There just was. And there were a couple of games that were released on both consoles. I don't want to say games, series. And you could argue that the Genesis got the better version of, said series. One example would be Castlevania. A lot of people out there would consider Bloodlines to be superior to Super Castlevania or Rondo of Blood. So it really depends on what you're looking for. But yeah, obviously not an apples to apples comparison, but Chase HQ2, that's all they titled it that on the Sega Genesis, but it was very much its own game, is superior to Chase HQ on the Super Nintendo, in my opinion. Kawasaki Superbike Challenge is better on the Sega Genesis than on the Super Nintendo. Formula One is another example. I'm going all over the map here. Like I said, it's a loose conversation. But a lot of it has to do with the Super Nintendo has that processor that's just not as powerful as what the Sega Genesis had. And that was, in my opinion, the biggest fault of the hardware for the Super Nintendo is that processor. That is, in my opinion, that's a big deal, because when you're talking about playing video games, the actual game and the way it plays and the frame rate and the way it feels and the smoothness of the controls, believe it or not, that takes precedent over everything. That takes precedent over graphics. That takes precedent over sound. And it's a big deal. So, if you're out there, if you're thinking about getting into the collecting scene for these 16-bit consoles, and you're interested in a lot of the multiplats, I would say go with the Sega Genesis. The games are going to be cheaper. The carts aren't going to be all faded because they're black. What else? They're just going to run better, like I said. You may not have the SNES color palette, but I think it's a fair trade-off to have, better frame rate as far as the gameplay is concerned. So, I don't know. I just, like I said, the 10-year-old in me, if you were to ask me this question back in 1993, and this is coming from someone that wanted a Sega Genesis for Christmas that year, and my parents ended up buying us a Super Nintendo, after we started playing it and getting all the good games for it, quickly made up our minds that it was the right decision for our parents to purchase a Super Nintendo. Like I said, all these years later, I'm not really clamoring to play Super Nintendo games. I'm sorry. I'm just not. I'm not. You guys are aware, you watch the channel here. I partake in a lot of speedrun challenges. And guess what? Most of the games I'm running are Sega Genesis games. They are. I'm not really pulling out the Super NES Mini, okay? I'm not clamoring to play games with poor frame rate, Star Fox, Stunt Race FX, So, yeah, I don't know. I just find the Sega Genesis over time, it's kind of like a fine wine. It got better with age. And it's kind of underappreciated, whereas a lot of the collectors out there, and a lot of the younger collectors, they've obviously gravitated towards the Super Nintendo. And I'm telling you, man, if you're interested in those multiplats, do yourself a favor and look up the comparison videos online. It's shocking. It's actually shocking how much better a lot of these games ran on the Super Nintendo. You could write a book on it. It's crazy. Earthworm Jim is another one. It was developed originally for the Super Nintendo. It's just crazy. So yeah, I really wanted to talk about it. I don't know if I have anything else really to say about that. I guess we could talk about the sound, the audio chip, right at the 15 minute mark here. So that was another thing. I was always, one of those guys there waving the Super Nintendo flag. Oh, the fucking sound chip. The sound is so much better on the Super Nintendo. Oh my god, the stereo sound. Yes, the Super Nintendo had a really good audio chip. Absolutely. It's very apparent when you play a game like Chrono Trigger, or you play A Link to the Past, where you're in the, like a church, cathedral, and you can hear the beautiful music. It's like a symphony. It's incredible. Final Fantasy 3, again, the Donkey Kong Country series. You know, the Super Nintendo had a really good audio chip. However, like I said, you know, getting more familiar with the Sega Genesis hardware, I've come to the realization that the Sega Genesis doesn't have a bad sound chip by any means. It just all depends on if it was in the right capable hands that could, you know, a dev team that could really exploit what that chip was capable of. You look at a game like Vector Man, or even Jurassic Park, which I think used the GEMS, the sound board or the driver, if you will, which is often criticized on the Sega Genesis platform. Hey, whoever was working on Jurassic Park did a hell of a job with that OST. We're talking Lotus Championship Racing, Lotus 2 Rex. It has incredible music as well. Barry Leach soundtrack. Some of that was actually repurposed in Horizon Chase Turbo. And yeah, the list goes on. I'm a huge fan of the Sega Genesis sound chip, excuse me. I almost kind of prefer it over the Super Nintendo, to be honest with you. It has almost like a Paula Abdul, you know, straight up now, tell me. You could have that song right in Streets of Rage 2. It'd be right at home. But no, seriously, the Sega Genesis has kind of like a synth sound to it, like a synth wave, like something right out of the 80s, which I think resonates with me a little bit more than the Super Nintendo sound chip, which almost kind of sounds, again, a little bit too clean, a little bit too colorful, not as badass as the Sega Genesis. So yeah, the child in me, yeah, I loved the Super Nintendo growing up, but the adult in me, at this stage in my life, I much prefer the Sega Genesis. I really, 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 really love the Sega Genesis a lot. And hey, if you're more preferable to the Super Nintendo, that's fine too. I'm not here to criticize you for that. I do love the Super Nintendo. Don't get me wrong. I'm not here to say that it's a crappy console. I just find, like I said, as I get older, I take off the rose-tinted glasses and I look at things at face value. And for me personally, it wasn't really about the exclusives. For me, I'm all about the multi-plats. And like I said, if you guys don't believe me, go on to YouTube tonight or tomorrow and check out some comparison videos. Any game that was released on both consoles, it's actually shocking, to be honest with you. It's really, really, really shocking. Anything from Clay Fighter. I'm trying to think of what other games were multi-plats. Primal Rage. Maybe those aren't the best examples, but you get my point. You know what I'm saying. So I didn't lump the TurboGrafx 16 in this conversation because I always found that was like the odd man out, if you will. That's a conversation we could probably have for another day. But I am really impressed with the PC Engine TurboGrafx 16 console. The more I start to get more familiar with it, the more it really intrigues me. But yeah, I'm going to leave it there. Almost at the 20-minute mark. We could probably talk about this for days. But I just wanted to, again, touch base on it. The war rages on. This is a conversation that will probably never end. But I wanted to sort of revisit it because I've changed my stance on, which console is better than the other. Again, I don't think either one is better than the other. Preferably for myself, I think the Sega Genesis makes more sense. But hey, maybe the Super Nintendo makes more sense for you. So I'm going to leave it there, guys. Thanks so much for watching. You people are wonderful and beautiful. You take care.